The
Oh my
millionaire's
goodness, I am
hand was
so terribly
trembling as
sorry.
he reached into his jacket pocket, not from anger, but from something Emma had never expected to see in the eyes of someone so powerful, genuine concern for her. What had started as the most humiliating moment of her career was about to become something that would change both their lives forever. But let me take you back to where it all began, 37,000 feet above the Kansas prairie, on what should have been just another routine Tuesday morning flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. Emma Rodriguez had been a flight attendant for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Not that she was counting or anything. Her hands still shook slightly every time the beverage cart hit a patch of turbulence, and her heart still raced whenever a passenger pressed the call button with that distinctive ding that echoed through the cabin like a judgment bell. Today was no different, except for the unusually crowded first-class cabin that seemed to be filled with an intimidating collection of business suits, diamond jewelry, and the kind of confident voices that commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals before lunch. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Emma had woken up that morning in her cramped studio apartment in Burbank, staring at the ceiling and giving herself the same pep talk she delivered every day before work. "You can do this," she had whispered to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting her navy blue uniform and trying to tame her dark curls into the regulation hairstyle. "You're good at this job. You're getting better every day. Today will be different." Her mother, Rosa, had called her the night before from their family home in Sweetwater, Texas, her voice warm with pride and concern in equal measure. "Mija, how are you doing? Are you eating enough? Are the passengers treating you well?" Rosa had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families her entire life, and she understood the delicate balance required when serving people who had more money than they knew what to do with. "I'm fine, Mama," Emma had assured her, not mentioning the nights she lay awake replaying every small mistake she had made during her shifts, or the way her stomach knotted with anxiety every time she had to serve first-class passengers who looked at her like she was invisible. "The job is good. I'm learning a lot." "Remember what I always told you," Rosa had said gently. "Treat everyone with kindness, but don't let anyone treat you as less than you are. You're just as important as anyone on that airplane." Now, as Emma smoothed down her navy blue uniform for the 100th time that morning, trying to project the confidence she desperately wished she felt, she could hear her mother's words echoing in her mind. Her supervisor, Janet, had specifically assigned her to first class today as part of her training progression, despite Emma's protests that she wasn't ready. Janet was a woman in her 50s who had been flying for 3 decades and had the kind of unshakable composure that Emma envied. "Sink or swim, honey," Janet had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's how you learn in this business. First-class passengers expect perfection, so you'll either rise to meet their expectations or you'll discover this isn't the right career for you." The words had stung because Emma knew there was truth in them. She had dreamed of this job since she was a little girl, watching planes streak across the Texas sky and imagining all the places they were going. When she had finally saved enough money to attend flight attendant school, she had thrown herself into her studies with the kind of determination that came from knowing this was her one shot at the life she wanted. The Boeing 747 was packed to capacity, every seat filled with passengers heading west for business meetings, family visits, or vacation getaways. Economy class buzzed with the typical mix of crying babies, chattering teenagers, and weary business travelers hunched over their laptops. But first class? First class was a different world entirely. one of hushed conversations, crystal glasses, and the kind of entitled expectations that could make or break a flight attendant's day with a single complaint. Emma had learned to read first-class passengers like a survival skill. There was the oil executive in 1A who always ordered whiskey neat and never made eye contact. The fashion designer in 3B who spoke only in clipped, impatient sentences and had once made another flight attendant cry over the temperature of her sparkling water. The tech consultant in 4A who spent entire flights barking orders into his phone and treating the cabin crew like personal servants. Emma pushed the beverage cart down the narrow aisle, her sneakers squeaking softly against the pristine carpet that probably cost more per square foot than she made in a week. The cart felt heavier today, loaded with premium liquors, fine wines, and imported coffee that cost more per pound than Emma's monthly grocery budget. She had already served most of the cabin without incident, managing to keep her nervous smile in place and her hands relatively steady. The oil executive had grunted his approval of his whiskey. The fashion designer had actually said thank you when Emma had delivered her temperature-perfect sparkling water. The tech consultant was mercifully absorbed in his laptop and had barely acknowledged her presence. Just 3 more rows to go, she told herself. You can do this. You've got this. That's when she saw him. Seat 2A housed what could only be described as the most intimidatingly perfect man Emma had ever seen outside of a magazine cover. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark hair that was styled with the kind of effortless precision that probably required a $100 haircut, and he wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been crafted by angels who specialized in making mortals look like Greek gods. His attention was focused on a tablet displaying what looked like financial charts and graphs, his fingers moving across the screen with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. Even from a distance, Emma could see the quality of everything he wore. His watch was a Rolex that probably cost more than her car. His shoes were Italian leather that had been polished to a mirror shine. His briefcase was the kind of supple leather that got better with age and probably had a waiting list longer than most restaurants. This was a man who lived in a world where every detail mattered, where imperfection was not tolerated, where service providers were expected to be flawless and invisible. Even more intimidating were the whispers Emma had overheard from the other passengers. "That's Marcus Chen," she had heard a woman in 3B murmur to her companion. "The tech millionaire. He's only 28 and already worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes." Another passenger had added, "I heard he just closed a deal that's going to revolutionize artificial intelligence. The guy's basically a genius. Companies pay him millions just to consult on their digital strategies." A third voice had chimed in. "My husband works in venture capital, and he says Marcus Chen is ruthless in business. Brilliant, but absolutely ruthless. He once bought out a competitor just to shut them down because they had insulted him at a conference. The man doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." Marcus Chen. Even Emma, who rarely followed business news, had heard that name. He was frequently featured in magazines and news articles as one of the youngest self-made millionaires in Silicon Valley, known for his innovative tech company that had revolutionized cloud computing, and his reputation for being both brilliant and demanding. Forbes had featured him on their cover last year with the headline, "The Boy Genius Who Changed Everything." The kind of man who probably had assistants to handle every detail of his life, and who definitely wasn't accustomed to being inconvenienced by nervous flight attendants who could barely afford to live in the same state where he probably owned multiple properties. Emma had read an interview with him once where he had spoken about his business philosophy with the kind of cold precision that made her understand why his competitors feared him. "Emotion is the enemy of good decision-making," he had said. "I don't have time for people who can't perform at the highest level. Excellence isn't negotiable. It's the minimum standard." Now, as she approached his row with the beverage cart that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, Emma tried to channel every lesson she had learned in flight attendant school. Smile, but not too much. Be friendly, but not familiar. Anticipate needs before they're expressed. Never, under any circumstances, make the passenger feel like they're inconveniencing you, even when they absolutely are. Emma took a deep breath and approached his row, her cartwheels seeming to squeak louder with each step. The sound felt deafening in the hushed atmosphere of first class, and she was convinced that everyone could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. "Good morning, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Marcus looked up from his tablet, and Emma was struck by his eyes. They were a warm brown that seemed oddly gentle for someone with such a fierce reputation. For a moment, he simply studied her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was cataloging every detail of her appearance. Emma held her breath, waiting for him to find her lacking in some way. "Coffee would be great," he said, with a smile that seemed genuine rather than the polite but distant expression she was accustomed to from first-class passengers. "Just black, thank you." His voice was warmer than she had expected, without the clipped impatience she had heard in his television interviews. Emma nodded and turned to pour from the thermal carafe, her hands betraying her nerves with a slight tremor that she hoped wasn't visible. The coffee was freshly brewed and steaming hot, filling the small first-class cup with the rich aroma that had become as familiar to her as her own perfume. As she prepared his coffee, Emma was acutely aware of Marcus's presence behind her. She could feel him watching her movements, probably cataloging her efficiency and competence the same way he would evaluate a business proposal. The coffee smelled expensive. It was some kind of premium blend that the airline served exclusively in first class, the kind of coffee that cost more per cup than Emma typically spent on groceries in a day. She had done this same motion hundreds of times during her training and dozens of times during actual flights. Pour steadily, don't overfill. Present the cup with the handle facing the passenger. Offer cream and sugar even though he had specified black. It should have been automatic by now. Muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice. But as she turned back toward Marcus, disaster struck in the most spectacular way possible. The plane hit a sudden pocket of turbulence. Nothing severe, just a brief bump that was common at this altitude and shouldn't have been enough to throw off an experienced flight attendant. But Emma wasn't experienced, and the unexpected motion caught her off guard at the worst possible moment. The cup tilted in her hand, and she watched in slow-motion horror as the scalding hot coffee arced through the air like a dark, caffeinated rainbow, heading directly toward Marcus Chen's pristine suit. The liquid hit its target with devastating accuracy, splashing across his jacket, shirt, and tie in a pattern that looked like abstract art created by her worst nightmare. The coffee was hot, hot enough that Marcus immediately sucked in a sharp breath and pushed back from his seat, his tablet clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent cabin. Emma's hands flew to her mouth, the empty cup dropping from her fingers to join the tablet on the cabin floor. "Oh my God," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sudden rush of blood in her ears. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The first-class cabin fell into the kind of stunned silence that typically preceded epic meltdowns.
Every passenger within a 6-row radius turned to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed amusement to anticipatory glee at witnessing what was sure to be a spectacular public humiliation. Emma could practically hear their thoughts. This is going to be good. Watch the millionaire destroy this poor girl's career. I bet she'll be fired before we even land. The oil executive lowered his whiskey glass and turned in his seat to get a better view of the developing catastrophe. The fashion designer pulled off her designer sunglasses, her eyes wide with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters. The tech consultant actually looked up from his laptop for the first time during the entire flight, clearly sensing that he was about to witness something more entertaining than his quarterly reports.
Emma's entire body was shaking now, her face burning with embarrassment that felt like it might actually be visible to everyone around her. She had just dumped hot coffee on one of the most powerful men in the tech industry, ruining what was probably a suit worth more than her monthly salary, and she had done it in front of a cabin full of witnesses who would no doubt be posting about it on social media before the plane even landed. Take a moment to like this video if you're feeling as anxious as Emma right now, and let us know in the comments what you would do in her situation. Her mind raced through all the consequences that were about to crash down on her like an avalanche. She would be fired, obviously, probably before they even reached Los Angeles. Her supervisor, Janet, would have a field day with this, and Emma's dream of building a career in the airline industry would be over before it had really begun. She could already hear Janet's voice. "I told you that you weren't ready for first class. This is exactly the kind of disaster I was trying to prevent." Her parents, who had been so proud when she got this job after struggling through college while working 3 part-time jobs, would have to watch their daughter become a viral meme about workplace disasters. She could see the headlines now. "Clumsy flight attendant destroys tech millionaire's expensive suit." The story would probably make it onto late-night talk shows, where comedians would make jokes about her incompetence while audiences laughed at her expense. Worse yet, Marcus Chen would probably sue the airline, and possibly her personally. She had heard stories about wealthy passengers who had made flight attendants' lives miserable over far smaller infractions than dumping hot beverages on their expensive clothes. This man had the power and resources to ruin not just her career, but potentially her entire future. He could probably have her blacklisted from every airline in the country with a single phone call. Emma's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely maintain her balance. Tears were starting to form in her eyes, hot and shameful, and she could feel that familiar tightness in her chest that usually preceded a full-blown panic attack. The walls of the cabin seemed to be closing in around her, and the whispers of the other passengers sounded like a swarm of judgmental bees. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking like she was 13 years old and had just broken her grandmother's favorite vase. "Sir, I'm so incredibly sorry. I don't know what happened. The turbulence? I'll get you towels and I'll pay for your suit and—" Her voice was getting higher and more desperate with each word, and she was dimly aware that she was starting to hyperventilate. This was exactly the kind of breakdown that would cement her reputation as the flight attendant who couldn't handle the pressure. She was going to cry in front of everyone, and then she was going to be remembered not just as the girl who spilled coffee on Marcus Chen, but as the girl who had a complete emotional meltdown afterward. That's when Marcus Chen did something that no one in that cabin, least of all Emma, could have predicted. He laughed. Not a bitter, sarcastic laugh that would have been the prelude to a devastating verbal assault. Not a cold, calculating laugh that would have signaled the beginning of her professional destruction. It was a warm, genuine laugh that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep and authentic. The kind of laugh that made the corners of his eyes crinkle and transformed his entire face from intimidating to almost boyish. "Well," he said, looking down at his coffee-stained shirt with an expression of amused bewilderment, "I guess this is one way to make sure I'm fully caffeinated before my meeting." The entire first-class cabin seemed to exhale collectively, but Emma was still frozen in place, her brain struggling to process what was happening. Was he making fun of her? Was this some kind of psychological torture designed to make her let her guard down before he delivered the killing blow? She had never encountered a wealthy person who responded to service failures with anything resembling good humor. But Marcus was already standing up, carefully peeling off his ruined jacket and holding it at arm's length with a rueful expression that suggested he was genuinely more amused than angry. "You know what? I've been wearing suits like this for so many years that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have something unexpected happen to my clothes. There's something oddly liberating about it." Emma stared at him with her mouth slightly open, her hands still trembling, but now more from confusion than pure terror. "Sir, I don't understand. Aren't you angry?"
Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her, and Emma saw something in his expression that she had never expected to see directed at her from someone of his stature. Kindness. Not pity, not condescension, but genuine, uncomplicated kindness. It was the kind of expression her father used to give her when she had nightmares as a child. The kind of warmth that said she was safe and valued and worthy of care. "Angry?" he repeated, as if the concept hadn't occurred to him. "Why would I be angry? Accidents happen. Coffee spills. The world keeps spinning." He gestured toward the mess on the floor with a smile that was growing wider by the moment. "Besides, I was getting bored with that particular suit anyway. You've just given me an excuse to try something new." The passengers around them were now staring with expressions of complete bewilderment. This was clearly not the reaction they had expected from the reportedly ruthless businessman, and Emma could see several people looking back and forth between Marcus and her as if they were watching a tennis match played by aliens. The oil executive's whiskey glass was frozen halfway to his lips. The fashion designer was leaning forward in her seat like she was watching the most fascinating performance of her life. The tech consultant had actually closed his laptop, apparently deciding that whatever was happening was more interesting than his quarterly reports. But your shirt," Emma stammered, gesturing helplessly at the spreading coffee stains that were turning his pristine white dress shirt into something that looked like modern art. "And your meeting. You said you had a meeting." Marcus glanced down at himself and shrugged with an ease that suggested spilling coffee on expensive clothes was something he dealt with regularly. The gesture was so casual, so unlike the controlled perfection she had expected from him, that Emma felt like she was seeing him for the first time as an actual person rather than an intimidating business icon. "Shirt can be cleaned or replaced," he said simply. "As for the meeting, well, I think showing up in a coffee-stained shirt might actually make for a more interesting conversation starter than my usual perfectly pressed appearance. Sometimes a little chaos is exactly what a situation needs."
He was already moving, crouching down to pick up his tablet and the empty coffee cup that Emma had dropped. The tablet appeared to be undamaged, protected by what looked like a military-grade case, and he examined it briefly before nodding with satisfaction. When he handed the cup back to Emma, his fingers brushed against hers for just a moment, and she was surprised by how warm his skin was. "Here," he said softly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Let me help you clean this up." That simple sentence, "Let me help you," was enough to completely undo what little composure Emma had managed to maintain. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, running down her cheeks in hot streams that she couldn't control. But they weren't tears of humiliation anymore. They were tears of relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite identify. When was the last time someone had offered to help her instead of expecting her to solve their problems? "You don't have to," she began, but Marcus was already reaching for the napkins from his seat pocket. "Of course I don't have to," he said easily, handing her several napkins while keeping a few for himself to dab at his shirt. "But I want to. Teamwork makes everything easier, don't you think?" As they both knelt on the floor of the first-class cabin, cleaning up the coffee spill together, Emma became acutely aware that every other passenger was watching them with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something that might have been admiration. She could hear whispered conversations starting up around them. "Is that really Marcus Chen on his hands and knees cleaning up coffee? I can't believe he's not screaming at her. I've seen him destroy people in board meetings for far less than this. Did you see how gentle he was with her? Maybe all those stories about him being ruthless are exaggerated. I heard he once made a grown man cry during a business negotiation, but he's treating this flight attendant like she's his equal. Maybe he's not as cold as everyone says. Look how he's taking care of her." But Emma barely registered the comments because she was focused on the surreal experience of cleaning up her own mess alongside the man she had just assaulted with hot beverages. Marcus moved with the same calm efficiency he probably brought to business negotiations, methodically soaking up coffee and making sure no one would slip on the wet floor. His movements were careful and precise, but there was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if he found the simple task of cleaning genuinely satisfying. "What's your name?" he asked quietly as they worked, his voice low enough that the other passengers couldn't hear. "Emma," she managed, her voice still shaky from the emotional whiplash of the last few minutes. "Emma Rodriguez." "It's nice to meet you, Emma Rodriguez," Marcus said, and the way he said her name made it sound like something special instead of just another entry on an employee roster. Her name sounded different in his voice, more important somehow. "I'm Marcus, though I suspect you already knew that." Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. She was still processing the fact that one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley was introducing himself to her as if they were equals, as if she hadn't just humiliated herself in front of half the first-class cabin. In her experience, wealthy people didn't introduce themselves to service workers. They simply expected to be recognized and catered to. "How long have you been doing this job?" Marcus asked, continuing their quiet conversation while they finished cleaning. His tone was genuinely curious, not the polite but dismissive interest she was accustomed to from passengers who asked personal questions just to fill awkward silences. 3 months, Emma admitted, the confession making her feel even more incompetent. An experienced flight attendant would never have made such a rookie mistake. She probably should have lied and said she'd been doing this for years, but there was something about Marcus's demeanor that made her want to be honest with him. 3 months, Marcus repeated thoughtfully, as if he was filing away the information for future reference. "So you're still learning. We all make mistakes when we're learning. I once accidentally sent a company-wide email calling our biggest investor an idiot. Took me 3 meetings and a very expensive dinner to fix that one." Emma looked at him in surprise, trying to imagine this composed, confident man making the kind of embarrassing error that would keep her awake at night for months. "Really?" Really? Marcus confirmed with a grin that transformed his entire face from business serious to genuinely approachable. The email was supposed to go to my business partner, but I hit reply all instead of reply. Spent the rest of the week convinced I was going to lose everything I'd worked for. The investor actually thought it was hilarious, but I didn't know that at the time. I was absolutely convinced my career was over. What did you do? I panicked for about 24 hours, then I realized that wallowing wasn't going to solve anything. So I called him directly, apologized sincerely, and asked if he wanted to have dinner so I could explain what I had actually meant to say. Turns out he respected the fact that I took responsibility for my mistake instead of trying to make excuses or blame someone else. Marcus paused in his cleaning to look directly at Emma, his expression serious but kind. But you know what I learned from that experience? Emma shook her head, hanging on his every word. Most people are more understanding than we give them credit for, especially when they can see that you care about doing better. And the people who aren't understanding, well, those probably aren't the kind of people you want in your life anyway. They had finished cleaning by now, but neither of them made any move to stand up. Emma found herself studying Marcus's face, looking for signs that this was all an elaborate setup for some kind of delayed humiliation, but all she saw was sincerity. His eyes were warm and patient, and there was something in his expression that made her feel like he actually saw her as a person, rather than just a service provider who had failed at her job. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. It was probably inappropriate to question a passenger's motivations, but she couldn't help herself. In her experience, people in positions of power weren't kind without expecting something in return. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression growing more serious as he considered her question. "You want the honest answer?" Emma nodded, bracing herself for whatever revelation was coming. "Because I remember what it felt like to be terrified of making mistakes," he said simply. "And because I've learned that how we treat people in their worst moments says more about us than how we treat them in their best ones." The simple profundity of that statement hit Emma like a physical force. She had spent her entire life being afraid of powerful people, assuming that wealth and success automatically made someone cruel or indifferent. But here was living proof that her assumptions had been wrong, or at least incomplete. Marcus stood up then, extending his hand to help Emma to her feet. His touch was warm and steady, and Emma felt a small electric shock at the contact that had nothing to do with static electricity from the airplane's recycled air. For a moment, they stood close together in the narrow aisle, and Emma was struck by how tall he was, how solid and reassuring his presence felt. "Now," Marcus said, once they were both standing, his tone returning to something lighter, "I believe you mentioned something about towels? Because as much as I'm enjoying my new coffee-scented cologne, I should probably try to make myself at least somewhat presentable before we land." Emma nodded quickly, grateful to have something concrete to do. "Yes, absolutely. I'll get you our premium hand towels and some stain remover if we have any, and maybe I can ask the captain if there's anything else we can do." "Emma," Marcus said gently, interrupting her anxious rambling with a small smile, "breathe." She paused, realizing that she had indeed been talking so fast she was starting to feel lightheaded. She took a deep breath, and then another, feeling her heart rate begin to slow for the first time since the coffee incident began. "Better?" Marcus asked, his voice warm with genuine concern. "Better," Emma confirmed, managing a small smile that felt more real than any expression she had worn all day. As Emma headed toward the galley to gather supplies for Marcus, she couldn't help but notice the way the other first-class passengers were looking at both of them. Some still seemed shocked by Marcus's reaction, while others were watching him with what looked like new respect. The oil executive had actually smiled and nodded at Emma as she passed his seat. The fashion designer had whispered something to her companion that sounded approving rather than critical.
The tech consultant had given her a thumbs up that was so unexpected she had nearly stumbled.
But it was the way Marcus was looking at her that made Emma's steps falter slightly as she walked away. When she glanced back over her shoulder, she found him watching her with an expression that was thoughtful and warm, as if he was seeing something in her that she hadn't even known was there. In the galley, Emma gathered every towel and cleaning supply she could find, her hands still shaking slightly, but now from adrenaline rather than terror. Her fellow flight attendant, Sarah, who had been working the economy section, appeared at her elbow with wide eyes and barely contained excitement. "Oh my God, Emma," Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing her arm with barely contained excitement. "Did that really just happen? Did Marcus Chen really just help you clean up coffee you spilled on him?" Emma nodded mutely, still not entirely convinced that the whole thing hadn't been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. "Girl, do you have any idea how many people would kill to have a conversation with that man? And you got one by accidentally assaulting him with beverages." Sarah's eyes were practically sparkling with vicarious excitement. "What did he say to you? Was he as intimidating as he looks in interviews?" "He was—" Emma paused, trying to find words for something that still felt too surreal to be real. "He was kind. Really, genuinely kind. Not at all what I expected." Sarah stared at her for a moment, then shook her head in amazement. "You know what? Good for him, and good for you for not completely falling apart when it happened. I probably would have fainted, then thrown up, then fainted again." Emma laughed despite herself, the sound coming out slightly hysterical. "I almost did. I think I'm still processing what happened." "Well, you better get those towels back to him before he changes his mind about being nice," Sarah said with a grin. "And Emma, maybe this job isn't going to be as terrible as you thought." Armed with her supplies, Emma made her way back to Marcus's seat, where she found him typing on his tablet with one hand while attempting to dab coffee stains out of his shirt with a napkin held in the other. The multitasking would have been impressive if it hadn't been so clearly ineffective. "Here," Emma said, settling into the empty seat beside him after getting a nod of permission. "Let me help you with that. I've gotten pretty good at stain removal. Occupational hazard." Marcus surrendered the napkin willingly, and Emma found herself leaning close to him as she worked on the worst of the coffee stains. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her feel slightly dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with the airplane's altitude. She could also see the fine details of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious reputation would indicate, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "So," Marcus said quietly as she worked, "tell me about yourself, Emma Rodriguez. What made you want to become a flight attendant?" Emma's hands stilled for a moment. Most passengers, especially in first class, treated flight attendants as invisible service providers rather than actual people with stories worth hearing. The fact that Marcus was asking felt almost revolutionary. "I wanted to travel," she said honestly, returning to her stain-fighting efforts. "I grew up in a small town in Texas, and I'd never been anywhere beyond the state line until I got this job. I thought being a flight attendant would let me see the world." "And has it?" Emma laughed, but there was a rueful note to the sound. "So far, I've mostly seen the inside of airports and hotel rooms near airports, but I'm hoping that changes as I get more experience and seniority." "What's the most interesting place you've been so far?" Emma considered the question seriously, touched that Marcus seemed genuinely interested in her answer rather than just making polite conversation. "New York City," she said finally. "We had a layover there last month, and I managed to squeeze in a few hours of sightseeing. I walked through Central Park and saw Times Square,
and I couldn't believe how many different kinds of people were all in one place, all living their lives side by side." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. New York has that effect on people. There's something magical about being surrounded by 8 million strangers who are all chasing their own dreams. "Have you traveled a lot?" Emma asked, then immediately felt foolish for asking such an obvious question. Of course he had traveled. People like Marcus Chen probably had their own jets and passport pages filled with stamps from countries she couldn't even pronounce.
But Marcus didn't make her feel stupid for asking. "More than I probably deserve," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Though I have to admit, most of my travel has been for business. I've seen the inside of a lot of conference rooms in a lot of different cities, but I haven't done much actual exploring. I keep telling myself I'll take a real vacation someday, but somehow there's always another deal to close or another meeting to attend." Emma looked at him with surprise. "You've never taken a vacation?" "Define vacation," Marcus said with a laugh that sounded almost sad. "I've taken trips where I only check my email every few hours instead of every few minutes. Does that count?" "No," Emma said firmly, her professional instincts kicking in despite their unusual circumstances. "That definitely doesn't count. A real vacation means going somewhere beautiful and leaving your work completely behind. It means trying new food and meeting new people and doing things that make you laugh." Marcus's expression grew thoughtful as he watched her face light up while she talked about travel. "You really love it, don't you? The idea of experiencing new places." "I do," Emma said, her voice growing softer as she lost herself in the dream of it. "I know it probably sounds silly to someone like you, who can go anywhere you want, whenever you want, but there's something about the possibility of discovery that it makes me feel alive. Like there's this whole world full of beautiful things and interesting people, and I want to see all of it." "It doesn't sound silly at all," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been longing. "It sounds wonderful." There was something in his voice that made Emma look at him more closely. For just a moment, his composed facade had slipped, and she saw something that looked almost like loneliness in his expression. It was the look of someone who had everything they thought they wanted, but was still searching for something they couldn't quite name. "Leave a comment below about the most interesting place you've ever traveled to. We'd love to hear your stories." The flight attendant call button chimed from somewhere behind them, interrupting the moment and reminding Emma that she was, technically, supposed to be working. She started to get up, but Marcus caught her wrist gently. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? Ruining your clothes and making a scene?" Marcus shook his head, his thumb brushing gently across her wrist before he released her hand. "For reminding me that there are still people in the world who light up when they talk about their dreams." Emma stared at him for a moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then the call button chimed again, more insistently, and she reluctantly pulled away to return to her duties. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of routine service tasks, but Emma found herself constantly aware of Marcus's presence in seat 2A. Every time she walked past his row, she felt his eyes on her, and whenever their gazes met, he would offer her a smile that made her feel like they shared some kind of secret. She noticed that he had stopped working on his tablet entirely, instead spending his time gazing out the window or reading the airline magazine, behavior that seemed completely out of character for the driven businessman she had read about in Forbes. During the meal service, Emma approached his seat with extra care, triple-checking her grip on every plate and glass. Marcus seemed to sense her nervousness and went out of his way to make the interaction easier, shifting items on his tray table to give her more room, and thanking her for each item she delivered with a warmth that made her feel valued rather than invisible.
"Everything looks delicious," he said as she set down his entree, a perfectly prepared filet mignon that probably cost more than Emma's weekly grocery budget. "Though I have to ask, is there any coffee included with this meal?" Emma's face immediately flushed with embarrassment, but when she looked at Marcus, she saw that his eyes were twinkling with gentle humor rather than malice. "I promise to aim better this time," she said softly, surprising herself with her ability to joke about the incident. "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied with a grin that made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't experienced since high school. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, Emma realized that she was dreading the end of the flight in a way she had never experienced before. In less than an hour, Marcus would disappear into his world of boardrooms and business deals, and she would return to her small apartment and her collection of travel magazines filled with places she hoped to visit someday. The thought made her unusually melancholy, and she found herself moving more slowly through her final service tasks, as if she could delay the inevitable by simply taking more time with each routine action. She had never felt this kind of connection with a passenger before, or with anyone, really. Most of her relationships had been casual friendships with coworkers or brief dating attempts with men who seemed intimidated by her dreams of travel and adventure. But Marcus was different. In the space of a few hours, he had shown her a kind of respect and genuine interest that she had never experienced from someone in his position. More than that, he had made her feel like her dreams were valid and worthwhile, rather than the naive fantasies of a small-town girl who didn't understand how the real world worked. The landing was smooth, and as passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Emma busied herself with the usual post-flight cleaning tasks. She was wiping down tray tables in the economy section when Sarah appeared at her elbow again, practically vibrating with excitement. "Emma," Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing her arm with barely contained glee. "You need to see this." Sarah led her back toward the first-class section, where most of the passengers had already deplaned. But Marcus was still there, standing in the aisle with his ruined jacket draped over his arm and a small piece of paper in his hand. He was speaking quietly with Janet, Emma's supervisor, who was nodding and smiling in a way that Emma had never seen before. When Marcus saw Emma approaching, his face broke into that same warm smile that had first caught her off guard hours earlier. "I was hoping I'd catch you before I left," he said. Emma's heart started beating faster, and she was acutely aware that both Sarah and Janet were watching the interaction with undisguised fascination. "Is everything okay? Do you need anything else for your shirt?" Marcus laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "My shirt is going to be fine. Actually, I wanted to give you this." He held out the piece of paper, which Emma saw was a business card. But not just any business card. It was thick, expensive cardstock with elegant letterpress printing that simply read Marcus Chen, followed by a phone number and email address.
"I meant what I said about how you should take a real vacation," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "And I think I know just the person who could use a travel companion." Emma stared at the business card, her hands trembling slightly as she took it from him. The paper felt substantial between her fingers, and she could see that it was the kind of card that probably cost more to print than most people's business cards cost to design. "I don't understand," she whispered. Marcus's expression grew more serious, though his eyes remained warm. "I'm supposed to fly to Paris next month for a business conference. It's going to be 3 days of meetings and corporate dinners and the kind of networking that makes my soul slowly die. But I was thinking maybe I could extend the trip a few extra days, do some actual sightseeing, visit some museums, try some restaurants that aren't attached to hotels, Maybe even take one of those boat rides on the Seine that all the guidebooks recommend. Emma's mouth fell open slightly, and she was dimly aware that Sarah was making some kind of squeaking sound behind her. That sounds amazing. The thing is, Marcus continued, his voice growing softer, I've realized that I don't actually know how to be a tourist. I can negotiate million-dollar deals and run a company, but I have no idea how to just explore a city for the fun of it. I could probably use a guide, someone who knows how to find the magic in new places. Emma felt like the airplane's oxygen masks had just dropped in front of her face and she'd forgotten how to breathe. Are you asking me to go to Paris with you? I'm asking if you'd like to take that real vacation we talked about, Marcus said gently, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Paris, all expenses paid, no work emails, no corporate meetings, just two people discovering a beautiful city together. Think of it as a cultural exchange program. I'll teach you about overpriced coffee, and you can teach me how to enjoy life. Emma stared at him, her mind racing. This had to be some kind of dream. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Flight attendants from small Texas towns didn't get invited to Paris by millionaire tech entrepreneurs they'd met by accidentally dousing them with hot beverages. Behind her, she could hear Janet clearing her throat meaningfully, and Sarah was making increasingly urgent hand gestures that seemed to translate roughly to, "Say yes, you idiot, before he changes his mind." "I don't understand why you're doing this," Emma said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression growing thoughtful. "Do you want the practical answer or the honest answer?" "Both. Practical answer. I'm tired of traveling alone, and you're the first person I've met in years who seems to understand that travel should be about more than just getting from point A to point B." Marcus paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing straight through to her soul. "Honest answer. In the space of one conversation, you've reminded me that there's a whole world out there beyond spreadsheets and profit margins, and I'd like to explore that world with someone who can see the wonder in it." Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of pure, overwhelming possibility. "I don't have a passport," she whispered, the practical concern slipping out before she could stop herself. Marcus grinned, the expression transforming his entire face into something that belonged in those travel magazines Emma loved so much. "That's what expedited processing is for. So, is that a yes?" Emma looked down at the business card in her hands, then back up at Marcus's hopeful expression. She thought about her small apartment, her collection of travel magazines, her dreams of seeing the world that had always seemed so far out of reach. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, encouraging her to be brave and take chances when they presented themselves. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, stronger, "Yes, absolutely yes." Marcus's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face into something that could have powered the airplane's electrical systems. "Perfect. I'll call you tomorrow to work out the details." As Marcus gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, Emma felt like she was living in some kind of alternate reality. The day had started with her being terrified of spilling coffee on passengers, and it was ending with her being invited to Paris by one of the most successful men in Silicon Valley. Just as Marcus reached the airplane door, he turned back to face her one more time. "Emma," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the nearly empty cabin. "Yes? Thank you for spilling coffee on me. It was exactly the kind of beautiful accident I didn't know I needed." And then he was gone, leaving Emma standing in the first-class cabin with his business card clutched in her hand and a smile on her face that she was pretty sure would be permanent. Girl, Sarah said, appearing at her elbow with eyes as wide as dinner plates. Did that really just happen? Did Marcus Chen just ask you to go to Paris with him? Emma nodded mutely, still staring at the business card as if it might disappear if she looked away. Emma, Janet said, approaching them with an expression Emma had never seen before, something that looked almost like maternal pride. I think you're going to need to request some vacation time. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation that felt like the most beautiful kind of chaos. True to his word, Marcus called Emma the next day, and their conversation lasted for nearly 3 hours as they discussed travel plans, passport expediting, and the 1,000 small details that went into planning a trip to Paris. Emma had expected their phone conversations to be awkward. After all, what did a small-town flight attendant have in common with a Silicon Valley millionaire? But talking to Marcus felt as natural as breathing. He was funny and thoughtful, asking detailed questions about her preferences and making suggestions based on travel articles he had apparently spent hours reading. I found this little cafe in Montmartre that's supposed to have the best croissants in Paris, Marcus said during one of their planning calls, his voice warm with excitement. The guidebook says it's been family-owned for 4 generations, and they still make everything by hand. That sounds perfect, Emma replied, curled up on her small couch with a notebook full of Paris research spread across her coffee table. I love places with history and stories. I thought you might. Oh, and I booked us separate rooms at a hotel near the Latin Quarter. I know this whole situation is a bit unconventional, and I want you to feel completely comfortable. Emma felt her heart flutter at his thoughtfulness. In the weeks since their flight, Marcus had been nothing but respectful and considerate, never making her feel like this trip came with any expectations beyond companionship and shared adventure. Her passport arrived exactly 1 week before their departure date, and Emma stared at the small blue booklet like it contained the secrets of the universe. It was the first passport she had ever owned, and seeing her name printed inside made the whole trip feel real in a way that all their planning conversations hadn't quite managed. Her parents had been initially skeptical when she called to tell them about the trip, but her mother's concerns had melted away when Emma explained how Marcus had treated her during the flight. "Mija," Rosa had said, her voice warm with emotion, "this man sounds like he has a good heart. Trust your instincts, but also trust that you deserve good things to happen to you." Her father, typically practical, had been more concerned about the logistics. "Just make sure you have your own money for emergencies," he had advised, "and call us every day so we know you're safe." The night before their departure, Emma stood in her small bedroom staring at the open suitcase on her bed. She had carefully selected each piece of clothing, wanting to strike the right balance between practical tourist and, well, she wasn't entirely sure what the other half of that balance should be. This wasn't a date, exactly, but it also wasn't a purely platonic vacation with a friend. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Flight leaves at 10 a.m. I'll pick you up at 7:30. Are you nervous?" Emma typed back, terrified and excited in equal measure. "You?" "Same. See you in the morning. Sweet dreams, Emma." The simple kindness of that message made her smile as she settled into bed, her suitcase packed and her passport safely tucked into her carry-on bag. The car that arrived to pick Emma up the next morning was not what she had expected. Instead of a limousine or luxury sedan, Marcus had sent a simple black SUV with a friendly driver named James, who helped her with her luggage and made pleasant conversation during the drive to LAX. Marcus was waiting for her at the airport, and Emma's breath caught when she saw him. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, his hair slightly tousled in a way that made him look younger and more approachable than the business mogul she had first encountered.
When he spotted her walking through the terminal, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they headed toward their gate.
"More than ready," Emma replied, and she meant it. The flight to Paris was everything their first encounter had not been: comfortable, relaxed, and filled with easy conversation. Marcus had upgraded them to first class, naturally, but this time Emma was the passenger rather than the server. She found herself relaxing into the luxury of it, accepting the champagne Marcus ordered, and settling into their seats with the kind of anticipation she had only dreamed of feeling. "Nervous about flying as a passenger instead of crew?" Marcus asked as they taxied toward the runway. "A little," Emma admitted. "I keep wanting to get up and help serve drinks." Marcus laughed. "Please don't. I think one coffee incident per relationship is probably enough." The word relationship hung in the air between them, and Emma felt her cheeks warm slightly. They hadn't defined what this trip was or what they were to each other, but hearing Marcus use that word made something flutter in her chest. 12 hours later, they touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, and Emma pressed her face to the window like a child seeing snow for the first time. Paris sprawled out below them, a mixture of ancient architecture and modern infrastructure that looked exactly like the photographs in her travel magazines, but somehow more real and immediate. "Welcome to Paris," Marcus said softly, and Emma turned to find him watching her with an expression of pure affection. 6 weeks later, Emma found herself sitting at a sidewalk cafe in Montmartre, watching Marcus attempt to order breakfast in his carefully practiced but heavily accented French, while the elderly waiter looked on with barely concealed amusement. The morning sun was warm on her face, the air smelled like fresh bread and coffee, and she had never been happier in her entire life. "I think," Marcus said, settling back into his chair after the waiter had departed with their order, "that I just accidentally asked for scrambled shoes instead of scrambled eggs." Emma laughed, a sound that had become as natural as breathing over the past few days of wandering through Paris together. "Your pronunciation is getting better," she assured him. "Yesterday you asked for directions to the bathroom and somehow ended up with a restaurant recommendation." "Hey, it was a good restaurant," Marcus protested, his eyes crinkling with laughter. "And the bathroom there was very nice, too." They had been in Paris for 4 days now, and Emma felt like she was living in the most beautiful dream imaginable. Marcus had been true to his word: no business calls, no emails, no corporate responsibilities. Just two people discovering a city that seemed designed for wonder and romance. They had climbed to the top of the Eiffel Tower at sunset, the city spread out below them like a glittering map of possibilities. They had taken a boat cruise along the Seine at midnight, the ancient bridges illuminated against the dark water. They had wandered through the Louvre until their feet ached, marveling at masterpieces that Emma had only seen in books. They had eaten more pastries than should have been physically possible, each one more delicious than the last. Marcus had approached each experience with the same enthusiasm Emma brought to everything, as if he was seeing the world through fresh eyes. She watched him discover the simple pleasure of people watching at a street cafe, the joy of getting lost in the winding streets of Le Marais, the wonder of standing in front of the Mona Lisa and realizing it was smaller and more mysterious than any photograph could convey. But more than that, they had talked, really talked, about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Emma had learned that Marcus's success had come at the cost of almost everything else in his life: friends, relationships, hobbies, the simple pleasure of sleeping in on a Sunday morning. His parents, both engineers, had immigrated from Taiwan when he was young, and he had felt the pressure to succeed not just for himself, but for their sacrifices. "I was always the smartest kid in class," Marcus had told her as they walked along the Seine on their second evening, the lights of Notre Dame reflected in the water below. "My parents worked 16-hour days to pay for my education, and I felt like I owed it to them to be exceptional at everything. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to just exist without achieving something." Emma had shared her own story. Growing up in a house where money was always tight, but love was abundant, working her way through college while her parents cleaned offices and hotel rooms, the way she had always felt like she was living in the margins of other people's lives rather than the center of her own. "I used to feel invisible," she had admitted, as they sat on a bench overlooking the river. "Like I was just there to make other people's lives easier, but no one really saw me as a person with my own dreams and desires." "I see you," Marcus had said quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I see how you light up when you discover something new, how kind you are to strangers, how brave you were to say yes to this crazy adventure." And Marcus had learned that Emma's optimism wasn't naive, but hard-won, forged through years of disappointment and rejection, and the kind of quiet determination that came from refusing to let circumstances define her possibilities. She had shown him how to find magic in small moments, the perfect flaky texture of a pain au chocolat, the way the light filtered through the stained glass windows of Sainte-Chapelle, the satisfaction of successfully navigating the metro system without getting lost. Now, on their fourth morning, Emma realized that she was falling in love. Not just with Paris, though the city was everything she had dreamed it would be, but with Marcus, with the way he listened to her stories as if they were the most important things he had ever heard, with his willingness to be vulnerable and admit when he was wrong or uncertain, with the way he treated everyone they encountered, waiters, museum guards, street vendors, with the same respect he would show to his business colleagues. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked softly, reaching across the small table to touch her hand. Emma looked at him, this man who had started as the most intimidating person she could imagine, and had become, what? Her friend? Something more than that. She wasn't entirely sure, but she knew that whatever was happening between them felt more real than anything she had ever experienced. "I'm thinking about coffee," she said with a smile. Marcus laughed. "Coffee? After all the amazing things we've seen and done, you're thinking about coffee?" "Not just any coffee," Emma clarified, her voice growing softer as she met his eyes. "I'm thinking about how the best things in life sometimes come from the most unexpected accidents. If I hadn't spilled coffee on you that day—" "We never would have met," Marcus finished, his expression growing serious as he looked into her eyes. "We never would have had this conversation, or this trip, or—" He trailed off, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. The morning bustle of Montmartre continued around them, street artists setting up their easels, tourists consulting their maps, locals hurrying past with fresh baguettes under their arms. But Emma felt like she and Marcus were existing in their own private bubble of possibility. "Or this," Marcus said quietly, and then he was leaning across the table and kissing her. It was soft and sweet and tasted like the promise of adventure. And Emma felt like every traveled dream she had ever had was suddenly coming true all at once. His lips were warm against hers, and she could taste the coffee on his breath, could smell his cologne mixed with the scents of the Parisian morning.
When they finally broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "So," he said, his voice slightly breathless, "how do you feel about extending this vacation indefinitely?" Emma laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy. "Are you asking me to run away to Paris with you permanently?" "I'm asking if you'd like to see what happens when two people decide that the best journey is the one they take together," Marcus said, his voice growing more serious. "We could go anywhere, do anything. I have the resources, and you have the sense of wonder. Together, we could probably figure out how to see the whole world." Emma looked at him, this brilliant, successful, kind man who had somehow fallen into her life through a coffee spill and a chance encounter 30,000 feet above the ground. 6 weeks ago, the idea of leaving her job and her life to travel the world with a near stranger would have seemed insane. But Marcus wasn't a stranger anymore. He was the person who had shown her that kindness was more valuable than wealth, that adventure was more important than security, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected accidents. "Yes," she said simply, her heart full of possibility. "Let's see the world together." Marcus's smile was brighter than the Paris morning sun, and Emma felt like she was finally living the life she had always dreamed of but never dared to believe was possible. "Perfect, but I have one condition." Emma raised an eyebrow, her lips still tingling from their kiss. "What's that?" "Next time we're on a plane together, I'm handling the coffee service."
Emma laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks, and Marcus joined her, their laughter mixing with the sounds of the waking city around them. And if anyone had told her 6 weeks ago that her clumsiness would lead to the greatest adventure of her life, she never would have believed them. But sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the smallest accidents: a spilled cup of coffee, a moment of unexpected kindness, and two people brave enough to say yes to the possibility of something wonderful. As they sat together in that Parisian cafe, their hands intertwined and their hearts full of dreams, Emma realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for her entire life: not just the chance to see the world, but someone to see it with. Someone who understood that the real adventure wasn't in the destinations they would visit, but in the journey they would take together, one beautiful, unexpected moment at a time. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that beautiful things can come from unexpected moments. And make sure to stay tuned for our next video, where we'll have another incredible story that proves love and kindness can be found in the most surprising places.